Well, good evening, all. Come on in and grab a seat. They're going fast. Yeah, if you guys can spread out and make yourself look fuller, I appreciate you being back this evening, and even some guests with us visiting specifically because Joel is our guest speaker tonight. So I told Joel, I said, we are going to we're going to do the shortened version of the any kind of opening preliminaries so that we can give maximum time to him and maybe even some question and answer time. So great to have you. Bow with me as we look to the Lord in prayer, and we'll get Joel back up here. Heavenly Father, thank you for beautiful Lord's Day that you have blessed us with. Thank you for time with you in your house, in your presence. And thank you for time and the opportunity to fellowship with our brothers and sisters in the Lord during and after and between. And thank you for this opportunity that brings us back together tonight. And thank you for Joel, that you have protected him as he has traveled to be here, to be our guest today. And we pray that you would bless his remaining time in this service tonight. May your anointing be fresh and new upon him. And then as he returns to his family in Georgia tomorrow, we just pray that your protective hand will continue to be all around him. And Lord, for those who have been battling illness, or are recovering from times of hospitalization, or are awaiting times perhaps of surgery that is approaching on the calendar. Lord, we just pray that those who are not able to be out and about, but maybe are blessed to join us online from home, we just pray that they would receive a special blessing as well from all of the things that we see and all that we hear. And Lord, for all that you do, we thank you and praise you for all that you are. We love you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Well, do I need to give a long introduction again? This guy's from Georgia by way of Singapore. I started to say seminary or something like that, by Singapore. And I'm glad, Joel, that you showed us the map, because I wasn't sure where Singapore was until you put it up on the screen. I tried to talk him into doing a magic trick tonight, but he still refuses to do that. He said it's just not a part of my presentation anymore. So sometime you got to at least tell me about that part of it and the street ministry part of it. That sounds like you've had a very colorful opportunity to share with lots and lots of probably pretty hardcore unbelievers out there. And so we appreciate your coming to be our guest this weekend. Would you give him a hand as he comes back to share with us tonight?
Good evening. Welcome back. So this session today, we are going to talk about racism. And when I first joined the office, the previous CEO, Gary Bates, he asked me to speak on this topic, and you wonder why. But I'll just skip the introduction, but for those who are not here, this morning, Creation Ministries, we have a website, creation.com. And a little bit of my background. So I did my science degrees in Australia. So I was there for 4 years, and I used to be involved with an open air street preaching ministry every Saturday from 9 p.m. to midnight. And I remember there was one day I had a very interesting encounter. Because, you stand up there, you get hecklers, they argue with you, that's normal. Sometimes you get white supremacists, that's normal. But on this very strange day, I had a guy who is, you would call a white guy. He was arguing that the Chinese are superior. He's a Chinese supremacist, but he was a white guy. And I'm of Chinese descent from Singapore. And so I'm arguing with him. I said, no, I'm not superior to you. We are equal. And he's saying, no, I'm superior to him. And so we had this back and forth, which was really strange to listening to me. You know, but as white supremacists, or in this case, Chinese supremacists, where they believe in evolution throughout history, has been very much the justification for racism. And so, you know, when I say evolution, if I ask you to think of an image, what comes to mind? You think of ape man and things like that. And in many people's mind, you have what we would call the ape parade. So on one side, you have ape-like creature, on the other side, you have the human, and in between, you have all these transitional forms. In fact, this picture is from the Smithsonian website. It's there today. Well, when they came out with this picture, CMI wrote an article. And we say, hey, do you notice something? Why is it that those in the middle, they all have ape-like features and they're all dark skin? Why are they all given dark skin? And people wrote in to complain. They say, oh no, that's not dark skin. That is just the fur, that's the hair that they have on their body. Is that true? Well, let's go to the Smithsonian website itself. And if you go, not the website, but if you go to the museum, in the website, you actually see these pictures. And by the way, these are all humans. That's why they call Homo sapiens, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, a small-sized human being. But they're really all humans. But in the evolutionary paradigm, this comes before modern humans. And is it just dark hair and dark fur? No, it's dark skin. It's these ape-like features. Why? Because evolutionists believe that one of these different racial groups, they represent the different, or in this case, these people represent the different stages of human evolution. So you can go to the museum, and that's what you see, all these so-called primitive men. Here's another one. Does anybody want to guess who this is? What creature is this? Yeah, that's actually my boss. Gary Bates. Yeah, our previous CEO, now he's retired, he's in Australia. But he gave me permission to use this. You see, if you go to the museum, you can actually take a photo of your face, and it would change it into one of these so-called, hominid, or so on. But notice something. It's not just dark fur, right? It's dark skin, ape-like features. Why is that the case? To really understand this, we need to understand something about history. So what I'm going to take you through, I'm going to take you through history, and you're going to see something interesting. And I hope this changes the paradigm that many people have in their minds. Well, early in the late 1800s and early 19th century, major cities in the West, many cities have what you call human zoos. Who has heard of human zoos? Nobody? The reason why is that this is not a very popular thing about history. So very often, it's swept under the carpet and nobody gets to hear about that. But it was very common in Missouri, in New York, in many places, in the US, in Europe, in Australia, many places around the world. But what is a human zoo? It is exactly like what it sounds like. It's a place where you take people of different so-called racial groups. By the way, when I say racial group, I believe that we are all one human race. Okay, but we are just different people groups that stem from Adam and stem from the 3 sons of Noah. But so when I say race, I actually mean that. But in this case, the human zoos are places where they put people of different races in different habitats, in cages and things like that, where you can go there and look at how these people live. And why do they do that? See, evolutionists are trying to use this as a way to educate the public about human evolution. So when you look at this pygmy group from Congo, we look at this group from China, you look at the different stages of human evolution. You see, if evolution is true, then and each racial group has been isolated for long periods of time. That means that some groups are going to be more evolved. Some groups will evolve slower, so they'll be less evolved. And so when you look at the different racial groups, they actually believe that you're looking at the different stages of human evolution. And in the human zoo, there are many of them there. And one of them that's very famous is this guy called Ota Benga. So who is Ota Benga? Well, he's a short guy, so they will call him a pygmy. He's from Congo. And he's not really that short, because I'm not very tall myself, right? And if Ota Benga would stand beside me, he would be about here. And you can't really tell from this picture, but he is dark-skinned, but not really dark. But they place him in the zoo, and they call him the savage. And by the way, the word savage is a term that Charles Darwin used for the non-white races more than 180 times in his book, The Descent of Man. They put him in the St. Louis World Fair together with other pygmies. And they thought that he was primitive. Why? Because he had dark skin and he was very short. And like I said, the human zoos were there to educate the public about human evolution. And by the way, in this talk, I want you to understand that I'll be quoting a lot of evolutionists. And a lot of these quotations, the quotes, they are extremely racist. I can just summarize that, but if I do that, you do not get the impact. You do not understand why this is such a serious issue. So I'll be quoting them. But a lot of the statements are extremely racist. And you need to take that in perspective of what's happening back then. So Ota Benga, they would call him the African pygmy, and they put him in the zoo, or sometimes they call him the missing link, by the way. That's another nickname of his. They put him in the zoo called the Ancient Ancestors of Man. And he was placed in the monkey house, in a cage, together with an orangutan. And he was there to promote the idea for this very purpose. And things like that. He got brought to the West here. And when he was here, he was actually owned by 4 individuals, 4 very well-known evolutionists. The first guy that brought him over was the explorer. He was a white supremacist, Samuel Werner. And so Samuel Werner was the one who went to Congo and brought him back. And in the diaries, Samuel Werner actually, he was horrified because on the ship, on the way back to the US, the missionaries that were there in Africa, in the ship, they were eating and sharing meals together with all these Africans. And he was horrified because in his view that these people are not fully humans. They're subhumans. So why are you sharing a meal at a table together with them? He was a white supremacist. The second guy that owned Ota Benga is this guy called William McGee. He's a famous evolutionist. Again, he's a white supremacist. And he wrote this book called The Trend of Human Progress. And in the book, he described how each human race is a different stage of human evolution. The third guy, another well-known evolutionist of his day. In fact, he was the director of the Bronx Zoo itself, where Ota Benga was placed. He is William Temple Hornaday, very well-known evolutionist. And he described Ota Benga as a genuine pygmy, belonging to the sub-race, commonly miscalled the dwarf. Sub-race, not fully human. And the fourth guy that owned Ota Benga is Madison Grant. And Madison Grant was the founder of the zoo itself. He was a leading racist. He actually wrote Hitler's favorite book, The Passing of a Great Race. And in this book, Hitler actually liked the book so much he called it his Bible. So what was this book about? Well, in the book he says that we need to implement a rigid system of selection through the elimination of those who are weak or unfit. In other words, if you are a non-white race, you are less fit, you should be eliminated. Does this sound like something that we read about in World War II? Yes. Why? Because this was Hitler's favorite book. 3 years after he wrote his book, Hitler went into politics. And we know the rest of the story. People think, oh, look at World War II, look at Nazi Germany. How could people at that time believe that? And many people do not realize that many of the German evolutionists were first influenced by the evolutionists here in the United States. And meanwhile, while you have Ota Benga and things like that, Christian leaders in the US began to protest against this zoo. So they were saying that, no, these are not subhumans. They said these are all people, they're all made in the image of God, we're all equal. So on one side you have the evolutionists who is saying that no, one race is superior to another, and the Christians are saying no, we're all made in the image of God. And here's the New York Times. And it says this, the pygmies are very low in the human scale. The idea that men are all very much alike except for getting an education out of books is now far out of date. He's saying that you Christians, you believe that we're all equal. So this whole idea of racism really want to talk about the human zoos today. But you would think that after World War II that the human zoos would be gone. Well, they still lingered on. In fact, the last human zoo is actually in Belgium, in 1958. And that's what you're looking at here. I'll just play a short video clip.
This photo was taken in Brussels in 1958. It's a picture of a human zoo, and it was not unique to Brussels. They had been hosted earlier in the century in London, Paris, New York, Oslo, and Hamburg. This typical village was set up for an exhibition in Belgium in 1897. Local Congolese spent their days in enclosures imitating village life. Visitors would jeer, laugh at, and ornamentalize them. One journalist who visited the fair wrote, "If there was no reaction, they threw money or bananas over the closure of bamboo." We don't know much about many of the people who were placed in the human zoos, but Otabenga, a young Congolese man, garnered fame. In 1906, he was taken to New York to become part of an exhibition at the Bronx Zoo. Benga reportedly believed he was hired to care for an elephant in the zoo, but instead he was given a home in the monkey house. After leaving the zoo, Benga found no comfort in America. Later in 1916, he shot himself in the heart. Human zoos have not been staged anywhere for 61 years, but one Belgium academic thinks mindsets still need to be changed.
So Otabenga, in case you're wondering why his teeth is so sharp, that's because they file it down to make it look fierce and scary. Here's another guy from the human zoo, Abraham Urikup. So who is he? He would be what we would call an Inuit. So he was converted by Moravian missionaries. So he's a Christian. In fact, he was described as a very devoted Christian, very smart guy. He could speak multiple languages. His native Inuit tongue, he could speak in German, English, he could draw well, he could write, he could even play the violin. In fact, he used to play the violin for his church. And the only reason we know what he went through was because he wrote a diary recording what happened. And he was taken to North America and Europe as a zoo exhibit, showing the different inferior stages of human evolution. In fact, when he came over, he came with his whole family. You see, he was told he had a lot of debt that he had to pay. And he was told that by being part of this, he could pay off his debt. So he got his whole family to follow him. And the idea was that he would come to the United States to serve a scientific expedition or for some scientific study. Of course, what they mean by scientific study turns out that he would become a zoo exhibit. And so he was placed in this enclosure with his family there. And when they were brought in, they were not vaccinated for smallpox. So what happened? They all caught smallpox one by one, and they all began to die. I think that he was the second last one in his family to die. And before he died, he actually wrote this. I think it's very sad. He said this, "I do not long for earthly possessions, but this is what I long for, to see my relative again who are over there, to talk to them of the name of God as long as I live. I am a poor man who thus." Very sad. Church are playing the piano, but because it's a different skin color, you throw him in the zoo as an exhibit for inferior stages of human evolution, all in the name of evolution. Here you can see people from different groups placed in the zoo. These pygmies from Congo like Otabenga. Australian Aboriginals were actually murdered, tens of thousands of them, and they were murdered. The bones were boiled down, turned into specimens, and then sent overseas to collectors. Why? Why could they do that? Because they were regarded, according to evolution, as subhumans, not fully humans. It's not just Australia. In the British Museum, they actually have the dead bodies of more than 10,000 people of what they used to call missing links. Humans, really, of the non-white races. Here in the United States, in Washington, we have the remains of over 15,000 individuals of different races. Some museums, they even have little pamphlets that they give out to people. And in these pamphlets, they actually tell people how you can go about robbing some of these graves. So you can take these specimens, how you can even collect your own specimens, pluck up the bullet wounds, right? And then you can clean it and then send it overseas to collectors. All in the name of evolution, because they were not considered to be fully human. And missionary accounts in Australia tell us how Aboriginal men, women, and little kids, they were killed. they had their skulls boiled down and then sent overseas. Why? Well, when Charles Darwin wrote his first book, does anybody know the name of his book? What's that? The Origin of Species, right? If you buy the book, that's the title, The Origin of Species. But that's not the original title. The original title of his book is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. This is part of evolutionary thinking. Of course, in this book, he did not really talk about the evolution of man. But in his second book, The Descent of Man, he became extremely racist. And you get all this racist statement from his second book. And in the second book, The Descent of Man, this is what he says. The civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Savage races refer to the non-white races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, he's talking about non-white human races, will no doubt be exterminated. Then the break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider. For it will intervene between man and in a more civilized state, as we may hope, even between the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of, as now, between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. So we put all these apes on the spectrum, right? So the white man on one side, the ape on one side, and all the non-white races in between, less evolved. Here we have Professor Peter Bauer. He's an expert on Charles Darwin, and he says this. By the time he writes The Descent of Man, it's pretty clear Darwin believed the non-white races simply do not have the capacity to be elevated properly into civilized human beings. They are mentally and morally at a more limited level. In a sense, they are stuck at an earlier stage in the biological evolution of the human species. The famous evangelical preacher Martin Lloyd-Jones said this: "The origin of species, I suppose, has been more responsible for undermining people's faith and belief in the scriptures and in God's way of salvation more than any single book." So Charles Darwin was extremely racist. I'm going to take you down history. I'm going to show you that from Charles Darwin to this present time, every 20 years or so, the evolutionary origin of man, the whole model changes. Everyone that they say was our ancestor, it gets thrown out, and a whole new model takes its place. So they keep changing every 20 years or so. In fact, I did my degree in evolution 20 years ago. Every single candidate that they used to say was our ancestor, every single one of them today is disputed by evolutionists. Yet each time, they say, you Christians, you do not know the science. This is the science, and science proves evolution. Yet every 20 years or so, they change. And around the time of Charles Darwin, there was a very staunch defender of Charles Darwin, so much so that they gave him the nickname Darwin's Bulldog. And that is Thomas Huxley, very well-known evolutionist of his time. And Thomas Huxley said this: "No rational man, cognizant of the fact, believed that the average Negro is the equal, still less superior, of the white man." Racism is not something external to evolution. It was at the very core of evolutionary theory. Thomas Huxley was called Darwin's Bulldog. Well, in Germany, there was another staunch defender. And so if this was Darwin's Bulldog, they called the other guy Darwin's Doberman. And that is Ernst Haeckel. And Ernst Haeckel is very famous again as an evolutionist. And in his book, he actually, the history of creation, which is what he calls his book, he said that humans, you can divide them into 12 species and then subdivide them into 36 different races. Species, like cats and dogs and things like that. So again, you see the evolutionary model has changed, but it's still the whole racist idea is still there. Stephen Jay Gould is probably the leading the leading evolutionist in the 1970s. And he actually says this. And by the way, Stephen Jay Gould, he says this: Haeckel's evolutionary racism, his calls to the German people for racial purity, right, so World War II, and unflinching devotion to a just state, his belief that harsh, inexorable laws of evolution root human civilization and nature alike, conferring upon the favored races the right to dominate others. He said that all this contributed to the rise of Nazism. The idea that if you are a superior race, you have the right to oppress or even kill off the less fit ones. So earlier on, I mentioned that the evolutionists in Germany were very much influenced by the evolutionists here in the United States. And 100 years ago, in the US, just 100 years ago exactly, I think, there's a famous trial, the Scopes trial. Who has heard of Scopes trial? Some of you, right? So what's the Scopes trial? They were debating in the US whether you should be able to teach evolution in the classroom. And a lot of that revolved around this textbook called A Civic Biology. So this was what they used. And by the way, all the things that they used to say that is evidence of evolution, almost all of it in that book is now refuted by evolutionists themselves. Okay, but in the book, A Civic Biology, this is what it says in the book. It says this: at the present time, there exists upon the earth 5 races or varieties of men, each very different from the other in instinct, social customs, and to an extent in structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type, originating in Africa, the Malay or brown race from the islands of the Pacific, the American Indians, the Mongolians or yellow race, including the native of China, Japan, and the Eskimo. And finally, the highest race type of all, the Caucasians, representing the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. This was a textbook that's being used to promote in schools here in the United States. The book continues to say this: it is not unfair to ask if the health and vigor of future generations of men and women on the earth may be improved by applying to them the laws of selection. Humanity will not allow this, but we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums or other places, and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibility of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. Remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe and are now meeting with success in this country. American evolutionists, highly influential, influencing those in Germany and in Europe. This is 1914, so that's some time before World War II. So now I'm going to take you 10 years into the future, 1924. And now you're going to see the evolutionary model changes again. Not the 12 species and all that, but this is what they believe now. There are 3 fundamental human types, the white, the yellow, and the black, related respectively to the chimpanzee, the orang, and the gorilla. Now today, if you tell evolutionists, you say that we did not come from ape-like creatures. If we did not come from the apes, they will say, yeah, you did not come from the apes, but we come from ape-like creatures. So evolutionists today, we believe that humans come from, you have a last common ancestor, one branch become the modern apes, like gorilla, chimpanzee, and all that, and the other branch become the Australopithecines. These are the missing links, and then from there it becomes the humans. So they would say that we did not come from the apes, we kind of branch out. But back then, they used to believe that. Back then, they would say that, okay, depending on your skin color, you have a different ape in your past. And it says this, 1924, the intermixture of Mongolian blood with Europeans, that means Caucasian looking, not Caucasian, but Asian looking like me. A Mongolian blood with Europeans results in the production of idiots and imbeciles who greatly resemble the orang and the Mongolian in physical traits. This special type of imbecile represents a revision to a type which is phylogenetically lower than the white man. In other words, less evolved than the white man. There is here implied inferiority of the yellow race. But the author is at pains to show that his imbecile has small skulls. How can we reconcile this with the fact that the yellow races have skulls as large, if not larger, than the Europeans? So you see, you remember at the start of this talk, I said I had that strange encounter with that Chinese supremacist, and he's insisting that I'm superior to him because the average Chinese cranial capacity is slightly larger, so I'm superior to him. Where did he get the idea from? From things like this. Evolution. Of course, you cannot just look at the brain capacity and say whether a person is smart or not smart, right? Because it's really, you have to look at the body proportion, you have to look at the brain size. It's really the way that the brain is wired that makes the difference, not just the size, but they used to believe that. Right? I'm sure, for example, if you are bigger in size, you tend to have a bigger brain capacity. That doesn't necessarily mean you're smarter or less smart. So that's what they believe. Depending on your skin type, you have a different ape in your past, whether it's a gorilla or orangutan and things like that. So let's go forward a few more years. Now let's get to the middle of the 1900s, 1965. So 1965, here you see the 4 races are still up there, but now we don't come from the apes. We come from the Australopithecines, ape-like creatures, like Lucy and things like that, right? So those are the ape-like creatures. And they believe that depending on the skin type, they come from a different lineage of ape-like creatures, Australopithecines. Look at that, different ones. So the model changed again. And then later on, 1 year later, this is the very first time, 1965. Some of you older ones, you may be familiar with this encyclopedia series. I have this in my office. And this is the ape parade, the very first time you see this image, where on one side you have an ape, on the other side a human, and in between, all these so-called missing links. And this is the image that sticks in many people's mind. And in the book here from 1969 on evolution, it says this: man is united in one species, but is racially divided into more than 30 subgroupings, which are distinct from each other in genetic type and in details of physical appearance. So this is not in the 1800s, this is 1969, very recent. It says in the book, the saving of life for reproduction by ever more efficient medical technologies result in an increasing accumulation of deleterious mutations. In other words, medical technology means that if you're sick, you can recover. Yeah, but that means you recover, but then you continue to carry on a lot of these harmful mutations to the next generation. And on eugenics, it says this: on eugenics and the pollution of the gene pool, it says this: not so easy, however, is the question whether a person who knows he carries a similar deleterious gene has the right to have children. In other words, it says that if your genetics, you're not very good, with a non-white race, or you have some deleterious mutation, you should not be allowed to reproduce. It says parents scoring low on intelligence tests tend to produce children, more children than those making high scores. Changes in the structure of taxation and in the award of family allowance and educational grant may already have removed some of the factors which have discouraged the more intelligent from having larger families. Mueller called this the present trend, a kind of natural selection in reverse. Helping the sick, helping those who are weak, he said that's not good. That's the opposite of what we need for evolution to be true. It has this same ape parade, except that all the candidates in the middle, they have all changed. And today we get to the Smithsonian, the exact same image there. That's stuck in most people's mind today. How many of you are familiar with the name David Duke? Some of you? Former Grand Wizard of Ku Klux Klan. Well, if you look at his background, he actually grew up with a Christian background. And then his father tried to reconcile evolution with Christianity. And the more he read, the more he realized that you cannot reconcile both together. So what did he do? He began to reject the Bible because he believed in evolution. And if you ask him for the reason or the justification for his racism, what do you think are the reasons he gave? First is his belief in evolution. Therefore, racism has to be true. Why? Because if some people groups are evolving on their own for hundreds of thousands of years or so on, or tens of thousands of years, then they're going to be far more evolved than some other groups that may be evolving slowly. So he said that, look, when you believe in evolution, you have to believe that some people groups are superior to other people groups. And central to his belief is also the belief in the great age of the earth. This is in contrast with the Bible, where the Bible says that Adam was 6,000 years ago, and that we all come from the 3 sons of Noah after the flood, 4,300 years ago. If that is true, then we are all one human race. There's no room, there's no time for one people group to be more evolved than another people group. So let's get back to Stephen Jay Gould, the evolutionist that I mentioned earlier on. He says this: biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but it increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. So that's when Darwin wrote his book. The litany is familiar: cold, dispassionate, objective modern science show us that races can be ranked on a scale of superiority. If this offends Christian morality or sentimental belief in human unity, so be it. Science must be free to proclaim unpleasant truths. What he's saying is that if you believe in evolution, you have to be a white supremacist. You have to be a racist. The second thing he points out is that what he recognizes that what the Bible says about the races contradicts this whole idea of racism. One of the most well-known atheists today, Richard Dawkins, he said this: I am a passionate Darwinian when it comes to science, when it comes to explaining the world, but I am a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to morality and politics. If that is true, then what would a consistent Darwinian be? You see, friends, I hope this is something that was key for me, and I think it will be key for you too. You see, when you think of racism, it's in the news all the time. Where do they pin the blame of racism on? Slavery, right? They always say slavery. Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, they always paint the blame on slavery. But think about this. The Origin of Species was written in 1859. This is 26 years after slavery was already abolished in the British Empire. One generation. Slavery was abolished more than one generation before that. And the second book that Darwin wrote, The Descent of Man, which is really racist, this is 38 years after the abolition of in the British Empire, and 6 years after the 13th Amendment in the United States. Slavery was long gone. Yet remember what Stephen Jago said: racism increased by orders of magnitude after Darwin wrote his book. So how can you put the blame on slavery if slavery is gone? Slavery was abolished in the West long before Darwin wrote his book, yet they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. In other words, historically, the justification for racism had very little to do with slavery. The justification for racism was mainly from evolutionary theory. If you understand that, that changes everything. And this is important, because if you wrongly identify the justification for racism, you're going to implement the wrong solution. You know, when I speak about this, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Sometimes it makes you angry reading some of this. That's a good thing. Why do I say that? You see, friends, history is not there for us to like or dislike. History is there for us to learn. And if it makes us uncomfortable, that is good, because then we will learn not to repeat the mistakes of the past. I'm going to show you a number of pictures. You may know these names: Karl Marx, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, Mussolini, Lenin, Francis Galton, which happens to be Charles Darwin's cousin, the founder of eugenics, and Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. These people were perhaps responsible for more human death in the last century than perhaps anyone else. Do you know what they all share in common? Every single one of them lists Charles Darwin as one of their favorite authors. Every single one of them. In fact, many of them actually believed that what they were doing was a very good thing, because that was a form of applied biology. Darwin wrote about this in The Descent of Man. He said this, that means allowing the weak to survive or to breed or survive diseases, must be highly injurious to the race of man. Excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. And his cousin, Francis Galton, he was the founder of the eugenics movement, where the idea that you kill off those who are less fit. And it says here that in the years leading up to the First World War, the eugenics movement looked like a Darwin family business. So Darwin's son Leonard replaced his cousin Galton as the chairman of the National Eugenics Society in 1911. In the same year, an offshoot of the society was formed in Cambridge, and among its leading members were three more of Charles Darwin's sons, Horace, Francis, and George. That's evolutionary biology here. Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, she was a white supremacist. She believed that one of the most wicked things you can do is to allow the non-white races to reproduce, because then the fitness of the race goes down. And so she actually put her clinics in so-called black neighborhoods and people of the non-white races, so that she could actually prevent them from producing more offspring. That was really the justification for Planned Parenthood, to prevent the non-white races from reproducing. She said this, that the brains of Australian Aborigines were only one step more evolved than chimpanzees and just under blacks, Jews, and Italians. Sanger, in alliance with eugenics and through initiatives such as the Negro Project, exploited black stereotypes in order to reduce the fertility of African American. And in her book, she wrote this: the campaign for birth control is practically identical in idea with the final aims of eugenics. Birth control propaganda is thus the entering wedge for the eugenics educator. Upon this basis only, meaning birth control, may we improve the quality of the race. The most urgent problem today is how to limit or discourage the over-fertility of the mentally and physically defective. Possibly drastic and Spartan methods may be forced upon society if it continues complacently to encourage the chance and chaotic breeding that results from our stupidly cruel sentimentalism. Our greatest need is, first of all, to cooperate in the formation of a code of sexual ethics based upon a thorough biological and physiological understanding of human nature. Look at this, 1921, right? About 2 decades before World War II. And she's saying that we need to prevent the non-white races from reproducing. And she says that we need to implement what? A code of sexual ethics. Invent your own sexual ethics. Why? She says this: if we can summon the bravery to do this, we shall best be serving the true interests of eugenics. So it's not surprised that here in the United States, there are laws against so-called mixed-race marriages in 27 states. There was human breeding projects and forced sterilization of over 60,000 US citizens, and even euthanasia. Why don't we read about this in our history textbooks? Now, of course, in Nazi Germany, they say we humans have transgressed the law of natural selection in the last decades, and that's why they would kill the Jews, they would kill those who are handicapped, and so on. And remember what Margaret Sanger said: you need to implement your own sexual ethics, invent your own sexual ethics. And that is actually what they did in Nazi Germany. So in Nazi Germany, they have what they call Lebensborn. So what's the Lebensborn? These are birth houses. And so the Lebensborn is also, they try to reduce the fertility, they reduce the population of the non-white race, but now they try to encourage the Aryan race to reproduce more. And so these Lebensborn places are birth houses. These are places where if you are of the Aryan race, you can go to these places and you can have extramarital relationships and you can produce a baby. And the state will raise up this baby for you. So if you're racially pure, they will raise up with all kinds of benefits. I know some of you may know the Swedish band ABBA, right? ABBA? You know Freda? So Freda was one of these kids who was born out of this Lebensborn program. So in Germany, there are more than 8,000 of them. In Norway, about 10,000. And Ukraine and Poland, another 20,000. Many of them actually kidnapped from their parents. So after Germany invaded them, they began to do this. And so what they would do is that here you can see that the German soldiers are actually pulling the kids away from their parents. And so they take the kids away from the parents, and then they group these kids into 3 categories. The first is, if you're of the white race, you're the desirable Aryan race, you'll be raised up by the state, you're given all kinds of privileges. In fact, in some accounts, they say that some of these kids, they were even given a bath twice a day. Okay, so all kinds of benefits. The second group are those who are acceptable, so the state will raise you up without all these privileges. And the third group are the unwanted. If you're a Jew or you're of a so-called race that is not one of these white races, what do? They either kill you or they put you in hard labor in concentration camps. like Ukraine, Poland, more than 20,000. There may be more, we do not know. And after the war, many of these kids could not be returned to their parents because the records were burned. So Freda was one of these so-called Lebensborn children. So her father is actually a Nazi German sergeant, and her mother is a Norwegian mother, and they went there to produce these babies. So here we have a picture of two different trees. The one on the left, racism, murder, abortion, gay marriage, euthanasia, all these issues. And on the right side, we have the things that the Bible teaches. People look at this and say, oh, this is horrible. And yes, it is very horrible. But they are really a symptom of a much deeper issue. What's that? It's really based on this. Who decides truth? If you're just a product of evolution over millions of years, who are you to tell me what's right and wrong? I can live my life any way I choose. But if there's a creator, we are his creation, God is going to tell us what is right and wrong. And one day we're going to stand before God to give an account for our life. We cannot live our life any way we choose. So all these are really a symptom of a much deeper issue. Do you trust the Bible? Do you trust the Word of God? And if you believe that God is our creator and we are his creation, then automatically everything on the left just collapses. You see, friends, when we talk about human evolution and things like that, you ask people, what's the evidence for evolution? And one of the things that they will always say is, what about natural selection? Doesn't that prove evolution? So when we talk about natural selection, we need to understand something about DNA. So what's DNA? Well, DNA is an information storage molecule in every one of our cells. It stores information in letters, A, T, G, and C. So like a book, you have information, tells your body what to make, when to make, and so on. So for evolution to happen, from a single cell to evolve into something more complex, like a humans and things like that, if it's starting from simple, you have maybe one book worth of information. For it to evolve into something like a horse, you need new information to make new biological systems, like a digestive system, like an eye and things like that. So you need a source of new information. So evolution really needs to account for how information can increase in a way that's relevant to evolution. Increase of information. So when you ask Richard Dawkins, how do you answer that? He says this, how do you explain new information? It's a question that nobody except a creationist would ask, he said. A real biologist finds this an easy question to answer. The answer is natural selection increases information content in genome all the time. That is what natural selection means. Really, is that what natural selection means? Let's take a look at natural selection. Well, natural selection is best defined as differential reproduction, or essentially meaning that if you can produce more offspring to the next generation, and if you're fit, you bring more of your good genes to the next generation, adaptation and so on. But natural selection, who came up with the idea of natural selection? A lot of people tell me, Charles Darwin. That's not true. Natural selection was proposed by Edward Blyth, 25 years, one generation before Charles Darwin. And Edward Blyth is a creationist. Natural selection is part of the creation model. Why? Because after the flood, we have a pair of every created kind. From the dog kind, we get the jackals, the wolf, the coyotes, the domestic dog, in just a short period of time, from the two ancestors that bought the ark. From the two ancestors bought the ark, a cat kind, we have all the different cats that we see today. Natural selection, rapid speciation, and adaptation is part of the creation model. It's proposed by a creationist. Evolutionists come along, they use this. Darwin hijacked it for his model, but it's part of the creation model. Evolution believes that creatures change slowly over time. Creation believes that creatures change very quickly over time, but within their created kind. In other words, a dog kind will never become a cat kind, but within the dog kind can have a lot of diversity in a short period of time, for example. Stephen Jay Gould, the evolutionist, he's actually lamenting here. He's complaining, he says this, natural selection ranked as a standard item in biological discourse among the pre-Darwinian creationists. The creationists were talking about natural selection long before Darwin. So how do you explain natural selection and adaptation? Well, maybe this might help you. So here we have two dogs. And you see the things in the middle, in the stomach, that represents their genes. So the smooth one would represent short fur gene. The one on the right, slightly more furry, that represents long fur gene. So you get half of your genes from your mom, half from your dad, right? So short fur and long fur, so this dog here has medium fur. Same with this dog here. So they have medium fur dogs. And these two dogs, well, one day they decide to fall in love and they have little puppies. So what kind of puppies can they have? Well, if you have short fur from dad, short fur from mom, you will have a short fur dog. If you have short fur from dad, long fur from mom, or vice versa, you're going to have dogs that are medium fur, just like their parents. And what will happen if you get long fur and long fur? What will you get? A really fuzzy dog. Okay, so now in one generation, you have all these dogs. You take them and throw them in Alaska in the middle of winter. It's really cold, right? So what will happen? Who will die out? The short fur and the medium fur. So now you only have long fur dogs. In the next generation, what kind of dogs can you have? Only long fur dogs. Why? They have adapted to their environment. They are completely different from the original parent. Rapid adaptation, but they have lost genetic information. They have lost the genes for the short fur gene. So yes, adaptation by losing genetic information. If you take all these creatures, you throw them in Singapore, which is really hot where I am, they will all die of heat stroke. Right? So this is adaptation, this is natural selection, but it's the opposite of what you need for evolution. Because evolution, if you remember, you need a process where you can increase information in a way that's meaningful for all the new biological processes that we're talking about. Natural selection works in the opposite direction. Another way to explain what natural selection is using this. So I have a bag of M&Ms. So supposedly, the red M&Ms taste the best, and I only pick out the red ones. What will happen? I will only be left with red ones. Now, I like this bag of M&Ms a lot more, right? But I've actually lost a lot of the genetic diversification. You follow what I'm saying? So in the same way, dogs do change, rapid adaptation, but they only turn into other forms of dogs. The Bible says that God created creatures to reproduce after their own kind. So the dog kind will never become a cat kind. So all these dogs, big and small, we all know that they came from a dog-like ancestor in the past. Like I say, off Noah's Ark, the wolf, coyote, domestic dog, dingoes, jackal came from a dog-like ancestor. We know that from genetics too. They rapidly diversify after the flood. In the same way, a lot of these big cats, they're even given different species names. But we know that they came from a cat-like ancestor in the past. There are 39 species of cats that we have. And we know that because some of them can actually hybridize. So here's the world's biggest cat. Does anybody want to tell me what is this? World's biggest cat, what's that? It's a liger, that's right. And a liger is a cross between a lion and a tiger. That tells you that this is the created cat kind. And the liger is actually not only the biggest cat, but it's actually fertile. So you can take a liger, and can cross it with a lion again to get a liger. And so this is what I wrote in Creation magazine, the liger, that's what it looks like. They're all fertile hybrids, okay? You can take a leopard and a lion, and you get a leopard. You can take the lion and a leopard. Leopard is what it looks like here. This is another picture of it. They're all from the cat-created kind, the feline kind. You take the tiger, cross it with a liger, you get a Thai liger. And if you take the puma or cougar, and you cross it with a leopard, you get this cute little looking creature that you see over here. So the 39 species of cats all came from a cat-like ancestor in the past. They can hybridize. Some not directly, but if you go indirectly a few steps, 5 steps, you can connect all of them together. Like the Bible says, God created creatures after their own kind. So what's a created kind? You have to look at it individually from a case-to-case basis. But in most cases, it falls between the genus to the family level. The created kind will be somewhere there. In most cases, it's really along the family level. So how many animals did Noah had to bring on the ark? He only had to bring animals that breathe air through their nostrils and the birds, right? A pair of them and 7 pairs of the clean ones. So if you look at all the created kind, if at the family level, which is most likely, it's only 1,000 families, so 2 of each kind is only 2,000 animals. But if you take it to the genus or even take it to the species level, there's 60,000 animals. There's more than enough space on Noah's Ark. In fact, the storage capacity of Noah's Ark, you can have up to 100,000 ship-sized animals living on that ark, and there'll be more than enough space. So the modern varieties of animals that we see today are just variations of the original created kind. So you see, friends, the Bible does talk about adaptation within each created kind, and not just adaptation, but extremely fast adaptation within a short period of time. But we can look at the Bible, right? And the Bible shows us this. So in Genesis, it says that God created God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing, with which the waters teem, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw it was good, and God made the beasts of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. How many times does the Bible have to repeat that? So by looking at these creatures that hybridize, we can actually know what's the original created kind. So here is a very interesting animal. Does anybody want to guess what animal is this? Close enough? That's a kama. So a kama is a cross between a camel and a llama, right? So that's the created kind that you see here. So this is a fun part of the talk which I like, so let's try to choose something. Let's see if you can guess what this is. So that's a kama, which I say is a camel and a llama. This is a wolfin. What's a wolfin? A cross? Yes, it's a whale and a dolphin, a wolfin. Okay. This one is a pig and a bull hybrid. I do not know what you call that. This is a buffalo. What's a buffalo? Anybody? Buffalo and cow, that's right. Liger, we saw that. This lion and tiger. I like this one. Paisley bear. What's a paisley bear? Polar bear and a grizzly bear. Zonkey. Zebra donkey, that's right. Zos, zebra horse. And this one, jeep or geep, I'm not sure how you pronounce that. What's that? Goat and sheep. So goats and sheep are the same created kind. Some of them can hybridize. They came from that kind. So when I say the rapid speciation after the flood, how fast are we talking about? Well, let's look at this passage from Genesis 15. But he said, this is talking to Abraham. God's making his covenant to Abraham. But he said, "O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it?" He said to him, "Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." So this is written about 427 to 436 years after the flood, not very long. And here we see that, remember the sheep and the goat, they can hybridize? Yet 400 years, you can differentiate the goat from the sheep. The turtle dove and young pigeon, they can actually hybridize. You can differentiate them from one from another. Here's another one in Genesis 30. "Let me," that means Jacob, "pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep, and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and they shall be my wages." Sheep and goat, the same created kind. Yet 500 years after the flood, they had already differentiated, so you can tell one from the other. The geep that we saw earlier on, sheep and goat hybrid. Here in Job, and Job lived around the time of Joseph, about 600 years after the flood. It says this: "Who has let the wild donkey go free? Who has loosened the bonds of the swift donkey? Do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane?" Right? Donkey and horse, same created kind. They can hybridize the donkey and the zos that you saw earlier on. Rapid speciation is part of the creation model, but that is not evolution. So when you go to an evolutionist, they'll say, yeah, you're right. Natural selection doesn't increase the information. It reduces it. But we get new information through beneficial mutations, right? So how do you answer that? So what are mutations? Well, mutations are copy mistakes in our DNA. So our DNA is like sentence of letters, right? So if you make typos in there, those are mistakes. And evolutionists believe that these typos over time actually allow us to make new body parts and new information. I don't believe that's possible. Right? How do you make mistakes, typos, and you end up with a different chapter for another book? But mutations are just copy mistakes in our DNA. So are there beneficial mutations? Yes, they are. But beneficial mutations, very often, they come about as a result of a loss of genetic information. So why do I say that? So one of the famous examples most of us know is beneficial mutation, antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So let's take a look at that. So here we have a normal bacteria. It's swimming along, it's very happy, and you apply some antibiotic in there. Oh no, it's poisonous to him, right? So what happens is that the cell wall, you have pumps, and the pumps pump in this toxin. So guess what happened? He dies. Normal bacteria. Now you have a mutant. And what happened with this mutant is that the pumps on his cell wall, they are spoiled now. The pumps no longer work. So when you apply the antibiotic, guess what? Because the pumps are spoiled, it doesn't pump the toxin in, and he becomes resistant, an antibiotic-resistant bacteria. It's beneficial to him, but it comes about as a loss of information. The pump no longer works. So that, again, is not an example of an increase in genetic information in a way that is meaningful for evolution. So Richard Dawkins, right, he mentioned earlier on. So we asked Richard Dawkins this question: can you give an example of an evolutionary process or mutation that increases the information in the genome? And I want you to listen to his answer.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Do you hear his answer? This is supposed to be the champion of atheism. He cannot even name a single mutation that increases the information in the genome. If evolution is true, we should find billions of such examples. We don't even have one. This is cut short because Richard Dawkins actually asked to be excused. He came back half an hour later. He gave an answer that is completely irrelevant to the question that was asked.
Professor?
Dr. John Sanford, professor at Cornell, in fact, he's actually the inventor of the gene gun. If you're into agriculture, GMO food, most of the GMO products that are out there in the fields, a lot of them are because of his invention of the gene gun. He says this: I'm still not convinced that there is a single crystal clear example of a known mutation which unambiguously created information. There are certainly many mutations that have been described as beneficial, but most of these beneficial mutations have not created information, but rather have destroyed it. John Sanford, of course, later on became a creationist, and to this day, he's actually very actively involved in creation research. The Bible tells us a very different picture of the evolutionary story that we read earlier on. It says in Acts 17, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. We all come from Adam. We all come from one of the three sons of Noah. If the creation is only about 6,000 years ago, there's no time for one people group to be more evolved than another people group. This historian tells us this: in earlier periods, one of the few persistent barriers to social Darwinian theory in Australia was the Christian doctrine that all human beings were of one blood. Christianity is the solution to racism. But you say to me, how can that be? I mean, I look at you and you're obviously very different from me. I mean, look at you. Some of you, you're yellow skin, you're black skin, you're red skin, you're white skin, right? Well, not really. Our different skin shades, we're all just different shades of the same skin color. What gives us our skin color is melanin, and the amount of melanin is what tells us whether we are dark skin or light skin. I mean, some people, they say that they are black. Are they really black? No, they're brown, they're dark brown. Some of you say you're white. Are you white? No, you're not. Take a piece of paper, that's white. You're not white. You're light brown. And some of you are a little bit pinkish because of the blood that's under your skin. But just all different shades of this same pigment called melanin. They say, are you sure? When I look at you, you're Asian, you have a very different eye. How do you explain something like that? Well, it turns out that these differences are all very minute. They're just skin deep. So let's talk about the eye, right? Because this is something that comes up a lot. So here on the left side, you have the European eye. On the right side, you have the Asian eye. And what makes a difference is that the Asian eye, you have a fat layer under the eye, and you have this fold here. And this is what you call an epicanthtic fold. And most babies in gestation in the mother's womb, they all have the epicanthtic fold. And as they develop, most of them begin to lose the epicanthtic fold. Well, if you're Chinese like me, you tend to keep this epicanthtic fold here to give you an Asian-looking eye together with a fat layer. But that is all that is. In fact, many times, like in South Korea or in places in Asia, sometimes they want a bigger eye, they go to a plastic surgeon. The plastic surgeon will cut the epicanthtic fold, and that gives them a much bigger, slightly more European-looking eye. The differences are just minute. In fact, you cannot just look at a person's skin color and then group them accordingly. Well, because if you look at the skin color, these are the 4 groups that will come up, right? So these are the white color, the yellow color, the so-called, the more dark skin, and then here at the bottom you have the dark skin ones here, right? And you would think that all of them would be very closely related together. But it turns out these two, right? Dark skin in Africa and in Papua New Guinea. But genetically, it actually turns out these 2 groups are actually the most different from one another. So you cannot just look at skin color and say whether they're closely related or not closely related at all. When you start with the Bible tells us that God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. So we all go back to Adam and Eve. And that's why Jesus Christ can come as the last Adam to die in our place. So he can be our blood relative, our kinsman redeemer. If we do not all go back to Adam, then Christ cannot be our redeemer. So we all come from Adam and Eve. And at the time of the flood, all humanity was reduced to 8 individuals, Adam and his wife, and his 3 sons and their wife. And the 3 sons and the wife went on to repopulate the earth. And then at the Tower of Babel, God confused the languages, and God sent them out according to different language groups. And as each group began to repopulate among themselves, they would begin to differ, and we come up with all these variations and different people groups that we see today. But we are all of Adam, all of Noah in the very recent past. So Tower of Babel, one common gene pool, right? And as you separate that out according to languages, you get different subsets of the original diverse pool of genes that Adam and Eve would have, and that Noah and his 3 sons would have. So like we saw from genetics earlier on, if our parents are of a medium brown, in one single generation, you can actually have kids from the lightest light to the darkest dark in just one generation. And this is one example from Creation magazine many years ago. We call this a 2-tone twins. And these two twins have the same parents. See, the parents are medium brown, and therefore their kids get the lightest light and a rather dark skin. 2-tone twins. There you go. So this is when they're slightly older. Right? So their father is what you would call a black Jamaican, the mother is a white English, and because of the medium brown, both of them, they have the right genetic combination. In one generation, they get different skin colors. So some of you may know that in the year around 2000, around that time, they came up with the Human Genome Project, right? The draft of the Human Genome Project. Well, evolutionists throughout the years has been saying that because evolution is true, you have to be racist, because one group is going to be more evolved than other people groups. We saw that the Christianity says something different. Christianity said that we all go back from Adam in the very recent past. We are all of one blood, all made in the image of God. And the good news is that science, genetics have actually caught up with the Bible. And this is one reason why most evolutionists today, they are not racist, because the science doesn't support that. But this actually caught them by surprise. So this is one of the guys that was very much involved with the Human Genome Project. And he says this, Dr. Venter and scientists at the National Institute of Health recently announced that they had put together a draft of the entire sequence of the human genome. And the researchers had unanimously declared there is only one race, the human race. Here's another geneticist involved in that as well. He says that the concept of race from a genetic standpoint has been abolished. Friends, science has caught up with the Bible. We actually know from science that all humanity actually came from one man in the past and one woman in the past. See, in most of our cells in the body, we have a power plant called the mitochondria that produces the energy. And mitochondria has their own DNA. And in most cases, we know that DNA is only passed down from the mother line, the mother to the offspring. So by looking at the mitochondria DNA, we can actually trace the female line. We came from one female ancestor in the past. All men, X and Y chromosome, right? We have the Y chromosome, it's only passed down from the male line, father to his sons, and so on. So we can trace that back. And we know that we all came from one man and one woman in the past. And evolutionists, they agree, except that they will push it much further back in time. So for the mitochondria DNA and the Y chromosome, they will call that mitochondria Eve, for example. And mitochondria Eve is way back in time. So why is that the case? Because in the evolutionary model, how do they calculate this? They assume the evolutionary long ages. So they assume the long ages, and then they look at the differences between all humanity today. We are all very similar. And they take the number of differences and they put that in this huge time span, which they believe encompass human evolution. And therefore they say, look, Eve had to be way back then. But there's a much better method that we can use. That's called the pedigree method. So what's the pedigree method? Well, you can look at the grandfather, you look at the father, and you look at the son. And we can actually trace how much mutations accumulate with each generation. In fact, just this week, I was told that they just came out with another paper where now they've done a 4th generation, so you can go 4 generations, and we know how fast these mutations accumulate. It turns out that every generation, we accumulate about 100 to 300 more mutations than the former generation. So I have more mutations, 100 to 300 more mutations than my parents, and so on. We are essentially going extinct, genetic extinction, essentially. Well, when you take that rate, the measured rate, we know how many mutations, we look at all humanity, and then we put that and we calculate that backwards. This is far more accurate. This is called the pedigree method. What do you think we find? This is what a secular paper says, not creation friendly, but it says this. If the high mutation rate seen in some human pedigree, that's the method we talked about earlier on, was used to calculate the age of our most recent female ancestor, she would have lived just 6,000 years ago, a date more consistent with biblical Eve than the evolutionary timescale for mitochondria Eve. Friends, science has caught up with the Bible. And we know that from the mountains of Ararat, after that, they actually spread out all over the world, just like the Bible says. It's a biological fact. We know from genetics today that all humans belong to one human race. We are all people everywhere made in the image of God. And therefore, like I said earlier on, Jesus Christ, because it's related to all of us back to Adam, he can be our kinsman redeemer, and he can take the penalty of our sins upon himself, so that those who believe in him one day will rise up with him forever, that the righteousness of Christ can be imputed upon those who believe in him. So in this talk, we cover a lot of things, right, on racism and things like that. So let us sum it up. So we have looked at the history, the impact of Darwinism on racism. So we look at the human zoo, Ota Benga, Abraham, and all that. We show you how every 20 years or so, the evolutionary model, which is racist at its very core, would keep changing every 20 years. Each time they say, you Christians, you do not know what it's talking about. Science proof evolution, science proof racism. But we show that science has caught up with the Bible. We look at chimps. But chimps and humans, actually what we know about them today show that they cannot share any common ancestor. Because all humanity today, we're like 0.2% different. We're all very similar in our DNA. Chimps, they're actually very different. I'll talk about this later on as well. But we're all different. The so-called races are just different people groups. We're all very similar in many ways. And the differences, like the eyes, skin color, they're all skin deep. They're all very easy to explain away. And the Bible tells us there's one human race. And science today, genetics, confirms this very picture. We are all made in the image of God, all descendants of Adam and Eve. And therefore, Jesus came as our kinsman redeemer to redeem sinners to himself and to undo the curse that came in through the first man, Adam. So what's the solution? It's the gospel. So earlier on, I talked about Creation Magazine. I won't really cover that, but in Creation Magazine, we actually talked, in fact, this recent issue, We actually talk about Neanderthals to talk about some of this DNA and things like that in humans. We talk about the people, Tower of Babel, where they spread out how different they are in genetics. That's in the issue of Creation magazine we have back then. But another thing that I'd like to highlight is how many of you here have heard the claim that humans and chimps are 98% similar? Anybody? Okay, so how do you answer that? Where did they get that figure from? That figure is actually from the 1970s. But you see, that figure was founded by this guy called Dr. John Elquist. He's actually a bird expert. And he uses a method that nobody uses today in genetics, because it was a very primitive method of comparing DNA. But he said that all humans and chimps were 98% similar. That means it's 2% difference. But our DNA is about 3 billion letters. 2% is 60 million letters. The evolutionary paradigm, humans and chimps share a last common ancestor about 3 to 7 million years ago. There's not enough time for humans to diverge from chimps. 2% is a big problem for evolution. Dr. John Elquist went back to his study. He realized this was a problem for evolution. Guess what? He became a creationist. And he was involved in creation research. That's Dr. John Elquist. He passed away a number of years ago, but before that, he used to come to my talks, and then after that, we used to have long emails where he would go back and forth talking about things like this. Because he's a bird expert, we talk about bird evolution and things like that. He became a creationist. This 98.5% similar that you see today, how do they get that? Well, it's very different, actually. You see, there are hundreds of gene families that is missing from the human DNA. There are hundreds of human genes, gene families actually, that's missing from the chimp as well. So you can't even compare them. So how do they get the 98.5% similar? Well, they remove the parts that are not, too different or missing because you can't compare them. They just compare the part that is similar enough. And then they used to do the human DNA there, and they used to take the chimp, chop it up to different parts, and try to align that with the human DNA. So they say this part from chimp, maybe chromosome number 3, I take it out, and this align with chromosome number 1, this piece here. This part from chromosome 14, I put in here. Now this part from chromosome 7, I split into 2, I reverse the order, I put it in there. And after doing all that gymnastics, that's where they get the idea of 98.5% similar. That's not realistic, right? If you only compare the parts that are similar enough, of course you get it to be very similar. But if you take the whole thing, like I say, all these gene families that are missing, it turns out it's just 85 to 87% similar. Very different. If 2% is too big a gap for evolution, if you're 85%, there's no common ancestry there. Human evolution has been debunked. Earlier on, I mentioned that as guys, we carry the Y chromosome, X and Y chromosome. The human Y chromosome is, and compared to the chimp Y chromosome, half of it is missing. You can't even compare half of it. And the other half that is similar enough to compare is only 70% similar. There's no common ancestry. And like I say, if you compare all people groups today, we are less than 0.2% difference. We are all one human family. Science has caught up with the Bible. So earlier on I mentioned Creation magazine. I won't repeat that here, but that's the first thing you should consider, Creation magazine. The Creation Answers book, where the different races come from, there's one whole chapter in there. In fact, another chapter we actually answer in there is where did Cain get his wife? So interesting question. Okay, so that's the book here, right? So one of the chapters in there. Second one deals with high school evolution and so on. Ancient DNA, there's another DVD that you might be interested in. Dr. Robert Carter, perhaps one of the leading creations in DNA and genetics and human population. So this is his lecture on that topic. And inside there's a QR code that you can use to stream on your phone as well. Dismantled, this is a documentary that talks about human evolution. Have you wondered about Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Lucy, and all that? He covers that in this documentary. And here's my favorite commentary on Genesis 1 to 11. I believe I've read almost every major commentary on Genesis, and this is by far my favorite one. Just under 800 pages, Genesis 1 to 11, covers church history, theology, and science. But what really I like about this book is the theological discussions that's in there. So lots of interesting resources and Creation magazine that I mentioned earlier on. So friends, today we saw that the justification for racism It's not slavery. It's really a belief in evolutionary theory. And we show you today that the solution is really the gospel. The gospel that's rooted in what the Bible says about Adam and about what Jesus Christ did on the cross. As you know by now, I like to end all my talks with a Bible verse, right? So you saw what happened in Genesis, you saw what Christ did on the cross. Let's go to Revelation. And in Revelation, it says this. And they sang a song saying, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seal. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." Friends, the solution to racism, the gospel. Thank you. So, Q&A? Okay. So as I understand it, we're going to open the floor up to Q&A. So if anybody has a question, you can raise your hands. I know some of you are shy to ask the first question. So let's skip the first question. Let's go to the second question. Anybody? Yes. Yes.
It also says that he had to be marked on his forehead so that no one would kill him. Who are the other people that would have killed him?
Okay, that's a good question. Who are the other people who would kill him? Does anybody have a Bible here? I don't have one here. Can you turn to Genesis chapter 5? And somebody who wants to volunteer to read Genesis chapter 5, verse 1? Anybody, if you have it, just read it out loud for everyone. Yeah, yeah. Genesis chapter 5, verse 1.
This is the document containing the family records of Adam. On the day that God created man, he made him in the likeness of God.
Okay, the next verse.
He created them male and female. When they were created, he blessed them and called them mankind.
That's not a good translation. And what version is that?
It's NIV, I think.
NIV. And the next verse after that? Verse 3, maybe? Yes. What it says in verse 3? Adam, when he gets to Adam, is it verse 3?
Verse 3, Adam was 130 years old when he fathered a son in his likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth.
And then, next.
Adam lived 800 years and he fathered Seth, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So Adam's life lasted 930 years, then he died.
Yeah, you catch that? Other sons and daughters. So you have Abel, who was killed. You have Cain. You have Seth. Then you have other sons, plural, so at least 2 more, and other daughters, at least 2 more, minimum of 7. If we continue reading the rest of Genesis chapter 5, each of those patriarchs, they have the main character and other sons, at least 2 more, and other daughters. So every one of them had at least 5. So this was not just Adam, not just Abel and Cain. Abel, Cain, Seth, and at least 2 more, and at least 2 more, at least 7. And Jewish tradition, which is not in the Bible, so we do not know this is true, but they believe that Adam and Eve, throughout their 900 years lifespan, had more than 50 kids. All right, so who did Cain marry? By that time, we have other siblings, so Cain would have married a close sibling of his. And you say to me, how can you marry a close relative? Well, at the beginning, they are all with perfect genetics, so that inbreeding will not be an issue today. Like today, if you have inbreeding, you have all kinds of diseases, because if you're closely related, you have the same mutations in your DNA, and your close sibling will have the same mutations in the same position. And so when you have kids, all those diseases start to show. But at the beginning, before sin entered the world or soon after, the DNA will be very pure. So having close relations would not be an issue. And so God only forbid incest at the time of Moses, but not before that. I mean, if you think about it, Abraham married his half-sister, Sarah, right? Sarah was his half-sister. That wasn't an issue, because the law against incest only came in at the time of Moses. But something interesting about Abraham, if I can just divert a little bit. Abraham married his half-sister, Sarah, and what happened? He had fertility issues, right? The next generation you have, Rebecca. That's actually the first cousin. What happened? Fertility issues. Then you go to the next generation, you have Rachel and Leah. Fertility issues. They are all closely related. three generations, or close relationship, and you see fertility issues. So by the time you get to Moses, you have all these mutations increasing more and more. That by the time of Moses, if you have close relationship with somebody who's closely related to you, you get all these diseases, and so God said no more. But before that, that was not an issue. So who did Cain marry? Cain would have married one of his close relatives, maybe a sister or niece, and so on. And that wouldn't have been an issue at the very beginning. Now, the second thing you mentioned about the mark of Cain, this is interesting. So who would kill him? His fellow relatives, right? Or even maybe the kids of Abel and so on. But the mark of Cain is interesting because when you talk about racism, one of the things that people say is that, look, dark skin is a mark of Cain. But where does it say in the Bible that dark skin is a mark of Cain? It's not there. The second thing is that the mark of Cain is never said to be passed on to his offspring, right? And secondly, at the time of the flood, all humanity was reduced to the 3 sons of Noah. So whatever the mark of Cain was, it was lost by then. And the most important thing is this: what is the mark of Cain? People think that it is a curse. It is not a curse. It is a blessing. It's a sign of a covenant that God is making to Cain. Because Cain complained to God, look, everybody is trying to kill me. So God put a mark on him and said that this is to protect him. If anybody were to kill Cain, the punishment will be 7 times worse. The mark was a blessing. It was this promise, a sign of this promise that God gave to Cain, so that his life he will not be murdered by his fellow brothers and sisters and so on. So not only is it not a curse, the Bible doesn't say it's dark skin, the Bible doesn't say it's passed down to the next generation, and the Bible, by the time of the flood, it will be all gone. So the mark of Cain is not dark skin at all. So I know that's slightly different from your question, but that's a question that comes up a lot. So I'm just mentioning this, especially since we're talking about the idea of racism and all that. So Cain would have married one of his close relatives, and he would be in fear of his life because all the other children by then, there'll be a lot of people around. Some of them will be trying to kill him. I mean, imagine if you're a child of Cain and somebody murdered your father, now you're angry, you want to take revenge, and so on. So I hope that answers that question. Yeah. Anyone else? No? It can be anything related to creation. Maybe this morning, dinosaurs, or the age of the earth, or even this. Yes? A good book talking about species of dinosaurs? I would actually recommend the book that I wrote, Titans. And because you already see that species is a meaningless word. Because when it comes to paleontology, what is a species? The definition of a species, biological species, is that they must be able to interbreed. Now, when it comes to dinosaur bones, you cannot tell whether they can interbreed, right? And so what evolutionists would do is that every little bone in their specimen that is unique and different from another specimen, even though they're very similar, they will give it a new species names. In fact, it's actually believed that the number of dinosaur species is overnamed by 3 times. So you can have a young dinosaur, then it grows big. So for example, Dracorex is one of the dinosaurs. It looks very much like a dragon. Okay, it's all these horns. And then when it grows bigger, the horns actually reduce and you get a slight bump. And as it goes older, becomes fully mature, all the horns goes away and you get a fully big bump, just the one that knocks his head. Okay, but that's the same dinosaur in 3 different stages of its life. And evolutionists come and they give each one a different name. And another thing is that we talk about, the Bible says that God created creatures to reproduce after its own kind. All right, so if we talk about the long-necked cephalopods dinosaurs, there may be many, many, many variations within the cephalopod, but there are one cephalopod kind. So the species name is really quite meaningless. How many T-Rex did God made at the beginning? 2? That's what people think, but the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible only says that Adam was created in pair at the start. There could have been 1 million T-Rex at the very beginning. So within the T-Rex kind, a lot of different variation, right? But by the time of the flood, then you're reduced to 2. And so creations actually start with a lot of genetic diversity, and by the time of the flood, it reduced to a little bit. And evolution starts with one common ancestor, a little bit of diversity, and then they have to explain everything that we see today. But there could be a lot of diversity within each of those created kind. So it really doesn't make sense for us to give each single one of them a new species name. But if you look at the book, we actually try to classify all the different dinosaur species that people are familiar with. We try to classify them among the major created kinds that we believe they are. So how many created kinds are there? It's only about 55 to 60 dinosaur kind. So if God is going to bring 2 of every kind on board the ark, we are only looking at about 110, 120 created kinds of dinosaurs, and that's all he needs. Oh, sorry, 110 or 120 dinosaurs, about 55 to 60 kinds. That's all he would need to have on the ark. So, yeah. So if you want to know where each one go, which created kind, look at the book that we wrote, Titans. It will explain that. Anyone else? Yes.
So one of the things you said this morning helped me about death and the curse of death wasn't issued until after Adam and Eve sinned. And so you talked about the evolutionists say there was death and stuff like that before.
Yes.
Billions of years before. So you also talked about Genesis 1 and Genesis, I think you talked about Genesis 1 and 2. So you have a gap theory in there. Can you talk a little bit about
The gap theory? Sure. Sure, I can talk about the gap theory. Whoops, what happened to my slides? Let me see. Do I have it open here? Let me see if I can open it. My mouse just vanished. Let me see. Okay, it's back. Don't ask me why, but sometimes that happens. Okay, so this will be, I have a whole talk on the different compromised views of creation. And so gap theory is one of those that I have in there. Compromised views of creation. And when it comes to the compromised views of creation, the gap theory is kind of dying out. It used to be very popular in the 1900s, but I actually do not know of any Bible college or seminary today that still holds to that position of the gap theory, except for maybe a Seventh-day Adventist church, Seventh-day Adventist denomination. They still teach that. Okay, so this is the gap theory. Let's turn to that. Oh, I need to plug this in. Okay, give it a few seconds to connect. Okay. So what's the gap theory? In Genesis 1:1, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And verse 2 says, and the earth was without form and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the earth. So what happens is that those who believe in the gap theory, they try to put millions of years in the Bible to explain the fossils that we find. And so they take these two verses, they split it apart, and then they put billions of years or long periods of time in between this gap here. And say in between this gap, now there's millions of years, and what happens is that Lucifer was ruling on the earth, and Satan is unfallen state, and then Satan rebelled against God. And so when Satan rebelled against God, then God sent Lucifer's flood, a worldwide flood in Lucifer's day, to destroy the earth. And that laid down all the fossils that we see today. And later on, God recreated the earth again, and you get the 6 days of creation. And that is their way of trying to put millions of years into the Bible. Well, so this is a translation, but really this shouldn't really be and, because in the Hebrew grammar, it should be now would be better. Because this is just done, in the Hebrew grammar, the way it's constructed, you really cannot separate Genesis 1:1 from Genesis 1:2. In fact, in the Hebrew grammar, Genesis 1:1 is a summary statement, and Genesis 1:2, you have 3 clauses that explain Genesis 1:1 in much more detail. So it's really bad Hebrew to actually separate that out and put in a gap there. But where do they get this idea of a Lucifer flood from? Well, it's not in the Bible, right? So this Lucifer flood, they believe laid down all the rock layers. So what then do they do with Noah's flood? You see, if there's a Noah's flood, a global flood in Noah's day, what would Noah's flood do? It would tear up all the pre-existing fossils from Lucifer's flood, and then it will lay down a whole new set. So your millions of years is no longer there still. Right? So if you believe in a global flood in Noah's day, how can you point to the fossils as evidence of Lucifer flood? So what do? Because they want to say there's a Lucifer flood, they have to say that Noah's flood is a local flood. But what do we find the fossil record? Human bones. So what do you do with that now? So now they have to say that Lucifer's flood, when Lucifer was ruling on the earth, he would say that there are soulless human beings walking on the earth. And then when the flood came, he destroyed all the soulless human beings. And those bones that you find are bones from these soulless human beings before Adam was created much later on. So in order to invent the idea of a Lucifer flood, they have to deny a global flood in Noah's day. Then they have to say there's pre-Adamic man before Noah. So if you really, really push them and say, where do you get this idea of a Lucifer flood from? Well, they bring you to Ezekiel 28. And Ezekiel 28 is very interesting because Ezekiel 28 is a prophecy about the king of Tyre. But then the language changes. And the language seems to speak about a divine being. So it's like, for an analogy of this, it's like, you know how when Jesus was telling Peter that he was going to die on the cross, and Peter said that, no, this will not happen to you. And what did Jesus say? Get behind me, Satan, right? Is he really calling Peter Satan? Well, I believe that Jesus is actually addressing the spirit that was behind Peter's statement, which is Satan. So in very much the same way, Ezekiel 28 is talking about the king of Tyre, and then the language begins to shift to seem to talk about the fall of Satan, the real spirit that was behind the king of Tyre. And let's read that verse. Ezekiel 28, actually it's verse 11 to 19 can read, but we just read from 12 to 19 onwards. Son of man, raise a lamentation. I want you to look at this and say, is this talking about a man, or is this talking about maybe the fall of Satan? Son of man, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre and say to him, thus says the Lord, you were the signal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in where? Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. Sardis, topaz, diamonds, beryl, onyx, jasper, and all this, right? Sapphire, emerald, carbuncle, and crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. So this being, the day he was created, he was covered in precious stones. It's not Adam, because Adam was created naked. On the day you were created, not on the day you were born, on the day you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed guardian cherub. What's a cherub? They guard the throne of God, right? You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you on the holy mountain of God, which we read earlier on is the Garden of Eden. In the midst of the stones of fire, you walking among stones of fire, so that's not human. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, from Eden. You were cast from Eden. And I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stone of fire. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I exposed you before kings to feast their eyes on you. By the multitude of your iniquity, in the unrighteousness of your trade, you profane your sanctuaries. I brought fire out from among your midst. It consumed you, and I turned you to ashes on the earth in the sight of all who saw you. So this being was reduced, was burned by fire, was cast out and reduced by fire. That's not Adam, because Adam, God actually redeemed Adam, right? He killed a sacrificial animal, clothed him with skin. That's a picture of the atonement. So Adam was atoned to God, but this creature, or whoever this being is actually destroyed by fire. And in verse 19, all who knows you among the people are appalled by you. You have come to a dreadful end and shall be no more forever. Who is this unfallen, anointed cherub who was walking in the Garden of Eden? Who is that? Sounds like Satan to you? So if this is the fall of Satan, where was he walking? In the Garden of Eden. When was the Garden of Eden created? On the sixth day. God created plants on the third day, but the garden was created on the sixth day, because in Genesis 2:8 it says this, and the Lord God planted a garden in Eden, in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. Man was created on the sixth day. Then God planted a garden and put Adam inside there, right? So this is the sixth day of creation. Satan, if that was Satan, he's walking in the Garden of Eden in his unfallen state at the end of creation week. Satan had not yet fallen into sin. Genesis said, and God saw all he had made, and it was very good. It was evening and morning, the sixth day. If Satan had not fallen into sin at the end of creation week, how can you put a Lucifer flood between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2? It doesn't work. So the very passage that the gap theorists bring up to support the idea of a Lucifer flood actually refutes them. The Bible never talks about Lucifer flood. At this point in time, Satan himself had not yet even fallen into sin. So I hope that answers that question. Thanks. Yes?
Joel, I might be taking my life in my own hands here to question you on this, and I'm not trying to do that. You place the gap theory between Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2,
Yes.
correct? I have been taught
Yes.
a version of the gap theory that doesn't come into being until verse 14.
Yes.
The fourth day of creation, in which God created the sun and the moon to govern the day and the night and the seasons.
Yes.
That does not come into existence until day 4
So you're putting the
of
gap.
creation.
Yes, the gap
And
in
so
day
days 1 to 3, if there was no sun and no moon to govern the 24-hour periods, 365 days of the year, how do we have any clue what that span of time was in there prior to verse 14?
Prior to the creation of the sun, moon, and stars.
Sun, moon, and stars.
Okay, that's a good question. So as I mentioned this morning, God said that he created a light source on day 1. So what's evening and morning? It's a rotation of the earth about its axis. So you have a light source on day 1, you have evening and morning one day. On the fourth day, God created sun, moon, and stars. That doesn't change the rotation. It's still 12 hours dark, 12 hours light. And the evening and morning is time on earth, and that becomes the basis for the Sabbath. That's a time that God has established. So the funny thing is that people come along and they say, how can you have a day without the sun when the Bible is actually the rotation of the earth? So you can have evening and morning without the sun. I mean, just change the light source, doesn't change the rotation. And they use that as an excuse to try to put millions of years into the Bible. But what is a year? What is a year? Rotation of the earth about the sun. They don't have a sun yet, right? So how can they talk about millions of years? So the argument actually backfires on them. Now you mentioned about putting a huge gap of time on the fourth day. That still doesn't work because as we saw earlier on, if Ezekiel 28 is talking about the fall of Satan and he's in the Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden was only created at the end of creation week, how could he have fallen on the fourth day? So I think that also applies to that. So any attempt to put any gap and a fall of sin coming in before Adam just doesn't work at all, I think. So Satan had to fall after creation week and before Adam and Eve fell, a short period of time. And by the way, we actually know when Adam and Eve fell. A short window, not exact. So we have a few clues from Scripture. So of course, like we saw, God saw all he had made was very good. Adam and Eve had not fallen to sin yet. So they had to fall into sin after creation week. The second thing we know is that Cain, at the beginning, when God made Adam and Eve, they had perfect fertility, no mutations. They would be obedient to God because sin haven't entered the world. What's the first commandment in the Bible? Yes, that's right, to be fruitful and multiply. They are perfect, without sin, they will obey God, they have perfect fertility. Guess what will happen? Eve would have conceived Cain very soon, right? Maybe within the first or second female cycle. Yet when Cain was born, he had the nature of sin. So the fall had to happen before Cain was conceived, because Cain had the sinful nature that came in through Adam. You follow with me? So the fall had to happen after creation week. But very soon, before maybe the first or second female cycle came along, because when Cain was conceived, he was already conceived. He had the nature of sin. Another clue we have is that the Bible said after they fell to sin, they hid among the trees, and God was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. He asked Adam, "Where are you?" And what was Adam's reply? He was ashamed, right? What's the reason he gave? He said that he was naked. Was he naked? No, he wasn't. He already made clothes of fig leaves, right? So he wasn't really naked. But he was hiding from God. But in that passage there, it said that God was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And in the Hebrew, it is in the hit pa'el voice. And the hit pa'el voice signifies an action that is done repeatedly or habitually. So God walking in the garden in the cool of the day is a habitual action. For something to be habitual, it means that it has to be happen at least a few times. So we know that the fall of Adam had to be at least a few days after creation week, and within the first or second female cycle, very soon after. That's when Adam and Eve fell into sin, that very short window. And we know when it comes to Satan, he had to fall after creation week, after the Garden of Eden was created, and just before Adam and Eve sinned. So it's not very long after creation that the fall happened. So I hope there's a little bit of information that you find helpful too. So, anyone else? No? No? This might be your last chance.
Now they can catch you back at the table.
Yes, they can, of course. Yep. If
Keep
not,
you here all night. We'll give you a key.
Yeah. Okay, so if there's no one else, I hand the time back to you, unless you have more questions or, yeah, anyone. No? Yes?
The blood in the blood banks
Yes.
doesn't matter if it's Chinese, Negro,
Oh, yes.
Indian,
The blood bank.
doesn't matter to inject it into anyone that is.
Yes. So the blood has to match, of course. And that's actually a good point, because actually, I didn't mention here, but we're talking about the races. And remember how I say that you really cannot classify people according to skin color? They may look dark skin, but genetically are very different from one another. So blood type is actually a better way of classifying human beings. A, B, O, right? And so on. And so actually all humanity actually are either A, B, or O. And sometimes you have one or two special mutations that cause some issues, right? But most of us are that accumulate over time, but most of us are A, B, and O. And so of course the blood type has to match. But if Adam is AO, Eve is BO, or maybe OO and AB and so on, then you can have all that variation within one generation, especially if you think that there are multiple kids. And so that would be in a human line very, very easy to explain. And actually on the topic of racism, blood type, I'm not saying you should do that, but blood type is actually a better measure of ancestry, I think, compared to skin color and other things like that. Yeah, animal blood and human blood is different. I'm just talking about human blood as ABO, but yeah, sorry if I misunderstand that. But yes, of course, animal blood is very different from human blood. No? Again, yeah.
Thank you
Thanks.
so very much. And just want you to know that I mentioned those of you who were here this morning, if you wanted to give something in love offering, but maybe you didn't have any cash and you left your checkbook at home, you would have a chance again this evening. So, Terry, if you would help me you don't even have to stand there and hold it, but if we could, place a offering plate at the back door there to give you another opportunity this evening, or spend all your money at the resource table. I know that they would be, Joe would be glad to pack up a lot less stuff and haul it out to his minivan. So stop by there if you will. Joel, I know that you slipped out there already, but I was going to tell you that I was a high school student in the early to mid 70s. And I know that a few of the kids that I have here, that is ancient prehistoric history to you guys. But I was mid 70s when I was in high school, and we were studying evolution. I know that would surprise you. I went to a public high school, and I was getting this barrage of, anti-Christian, the Bible is, a fable, a fairy tale, and anybody who believes it is an idiot. A barrage of that, and so, who do you turn to when you're a teenager? And, I said something to my pastor, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to respond to all this. And I remember that my pastor gave me a book that was entitled Evolution, The Fossils Say No by Dwayne Gish. And I was going to ask Joel if that name rings a bell with you. Is that still a book that is even available in the market today? Evolution, The Fossils Say No by Dwayne Gish. Is that a name that rings a bell with you? The book, Evolution, The Fossils Say No by Dwayne Gish. That was a book that my pastor gave me in the mid-70s. And I had only read probably a quarter to a third of the book when I made the mistake, well, it may not have been a mistake, of carrying it on the top of my book stack into my biology class. And when my teacher saw it, he went ballistic on me. And I wasn't mature enough or hadn't read enough of the book to be articulate on it, but somehow I was able to stand my ground with him, and I remained a Christian. I remained a creationist Christian, but that was my first exposure to apologetics that you are very skilled in, and I was just curious. I see Chuck is dying to answer this question here. Are you familiar with the author of the book? Okay. Okay, that has stuck in my mind all these years, the title and the author of it. And I didn't know if I was assuming by now Dwayne Gish was probably in heaven, but I didn't know if that book was still even, available on the market, because that was the one thing that gave me some ammunition. I didn't know how to use it very well, but I had that one book when I was just getting this nonstop barrage of Darwinism and evolution and you're an idiot if you believe the Bible and all that. That was kind of my saving grace, as I would have been probably a high school sophomore.
Oh, wow.
Oh, Mark can look things up immediately. Okay. Okay, well, that was my story, and I guess my question there, if you were even familiar with that author.
Yes, Dwayne Gish is actually on my bookshelf in my office.
Okay.
Yes.
Guys, I appreciate you being here this morning and this evening. Let me pray and encourage you to stop. If there are too many people looking at the fossils this morning that you didn't want to crowd up to the table, you have a little less competition this evening, okay? So pray with me. Father God, thank you so much for enlightenment. Thank you for information. Thank you for your word and the authority of your word. We stand upon the inspiration, and your word is the inspired, the inerrant, the infallible word of God. And this we profess, and this I believe. And so, Lord, teach us to so order our lives and our relationships with others who might look different than me in this world, that we may reach them for Jesus Christ. Watch over us as we go from this place. Keep your protective hand upon us, I pray, and bring us back together soon and safely. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. God bless.